Good evening and welcome to, I better record this, okay. Good evening and welcome to our study of Elizabeth Mattis Namgyel's The Logic of Faith. Last year, by chance, I came across this book and found it extremely helpful. And not long after, by chance, Elizabeth came to Australia and was teaching here. And I found her a really clear and very compassionate, engaging Buddhist teacher. And so I'm very happy to be able to present this as a webinar. This work is really important because it is basically a presentation of bringing together two really important aspects of Buddhist practice and theory, which is the logical and the intuitive. So with the logic of what Elizabeth is speaking about here, what she calls the open question, the open questioning, we are questioning our perceptions. We are essentially developing prajna and beginning to see our reality clearer, but that also opens up a dimension that is free. It is intelligent, yet it's free from the ordinary grasping mind. In itself, it is present without trying to establish a new dogma, a new dogmatic position. So this approach, which is about finding a certainty in the sense of opening ourselves to reality, contains this dimension of faith, this dimension of trusting in our intelligence. But it's not about trusting our intelligence in the sense of asserting or developing a new belief. And it's also not about freezing in a condition of doubt. So this is a brilliant approach to this, what we in Buddhism refer to as prajna paramita, the transcending discipline, or the practice of transcending ordinary conceptual constructs and enabling innate wisdom. And also it's what's implicit in what we call the middle way. All of this, which in Buddhism is all these teachings on wisdom, which are intended to facilitate an opening up to our reality, sometimes when it's presented in a language, a discourse that we're unfamiliar with, can sometimes be a bit overwhelming. So you sometimes have students who have been exposed to Madhyamika or Prajna Paramita that are still struggling in some way to align this with, you could say, a logic of understanding and also their own practice. And I think Elizabeth is doing a wonderful job in this book here in presenting this. So here is Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was a student also of my teacher, Dinghu Chenzo Rinpoche, and also, of course, of Ziga Kongtrul Rinpoche. In the beginning of the book, then, she has this ode to grace, which is very beautiful. She writes, "I pledge allegiance to the experience of grace, the expression of human insight from which all authentic faith traditions have arisen. I pledge allegiance to Mother Emptiness, Prajna Paramita, to the wisdom of the Buddha, and to the great spiritual genius, Nagarjuna. First and foremost, I pledge allegiance to my beloved teacher, Ziga Kongtrul Rinpoche." So this prajna, the nature of reality, it is the recognition of this which enables seeing reality clearly. And so we say this is the mother of all the Buddhas. And particularly in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, and actually also Nagarjuna has a role in the Chan and Zen traditions in their lineage. Nagarjuna is one who really helped the Buddhist teaching clarify this understanding of wisdom. Zika Kongtrul Rinpoche is an important teacher, probably doesn't need much introduction, but a close student of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche and also several great masters and Khenpos and so forth, someone who really has done a lot to bring the Buddhist teaching to the modern world. I want to go into some detail. I'll be reading quite a bit from the foreword by Thupten Jimba, and also Thupten Jimba probably doesn't need much introduction, but he is a Geshe Tlarampa. He's presently a layperson living in Canada, a doctor, PhD, who has served as translator for His Holiness the Dalai Lama on many occasions, and I think in the book it says the principal translator of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and also the head of a great project called what is it again? I think Tibetan Classics. Some very good high quality translations of important works in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Anyway, he writes in here when he presents Elizabeth's work, he highlights how this addresses some of the most challenging questions of spirituality, which is the nature of faith, because faith really is what enables us to open up to that which lies beyond the linear logic of the rational mind. Of course, the rational mind can be very helpful, but ultimately we need to go beyond that. So this is helpful in the sense also in regards to how faith relates to human rationality, human reason, and also how these in turn they function in terms of the path to awakening. And this work then is one that addresses the fundamental question of the relationship between our perception, which is something very relative, and the nature of reality, which is what we, with the Buddhist teaching, are awakening to. He says, in taking the role of critical inquiry or analytical meditation as part of the path seriously, I see this book as an important and timely corrective to the growing trend within contemporary writings on Buddhism, many of which tend to ignore the more proactive approach of what the Buddhist tradition calls the wisdom aspect of the path. And this is true in the sense that a lot of what we, in the modern Buddhism, what we find is obviously connects with an intuitive appreciation of what we could call the nature of mind or wisdom or emptiness, shunyata, and so forth. But in fact, something that very often is sort of left in the realm of the slightly vague. And the Indo-Tibetan tradition is quite clear on how to initially develop some idea of where we're heading. Of course, the map is not the territory, but at the same time, we need to know where we're going. And that's where analytical meditation and the analytical practice, what he calls the proactive approach, is really essential. In here, then, the key, or one of the key themes of this book is then understanding what is meant in Buddhism with dependent arising, praticca samutpada, arising through dependence and in a related manner. This simply means that phenomena, they don't exist independently or unconditionally, but they all exist in dependency as conditioned phenomena. Things arise in dependence upon some other factors. They do not arise in isolation, but within a web of deeply interconnected complexity. So this reality that we very often freeze or that we solidify on the basis of our particular relative position needs to be understood with a wider perspective through the vipassana that sees the dependent arising. The Buddha illustrates this dependence with the imagery of two bundles of reeds leaning up against each other. And we'll see this also in Elizabeth's own introduction, writing how this idea of phenomena leaning, nothing actually exists without the other. Thupten Jinpa writes, the early Buddhists understood this principle in terms of mere conditionedness, offering a way of understanding both our own existence as well as the world's, not as something predestined, but simply through the coming together of causes and conditions. Famously, the Buddha said, and I think also in the mail I sent out here for the registration, I quoted the rice seedling where you see this, but also then in the Pali Canon, the Buddha says in one sutta, he who sees dependent arising sees the Dhamma. He who sees the Dhamma sees dependent arising. So Dhamma, the law of reality, the nature of reality, is independent from this recognition of dependent arising. And also, we often see this line that says, when this exists, that exists. From the arising of this, that arises. So all phenomena exists relatively independency. And then very often we chant, and particularly in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we actually chant this as a mantra. We turn this statement, which comes from the Sutra of dependent arising or dependent origination. Sometimes it's said it comes from the sutra. Sometimes also we say that it was the monk Assaji, when he met Shariputra as a young man. Shariputra asked, what is it, this teacher of yours, the Buddha, he teaches? And so Assaji, he said, and he then spoke this Yadharma, Hetu Prabhava Hetum Tesham Tathagata Hayawata Tesham Chayo Niroda Eombadi Mahashamana. So that's what he said. And it means all things arise from their causes. And the Tathagata taught, meaning the Buddha, that those causes are. He taught what those causes are, and also what puts an end to those causes, meaning the causes of dualistic perception, suffering. This too was taught by the great monk, also meaning the Buddha. So this understanding of causation really is key in the Buddhist teaching, and in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we actually put an Om in front of this Sanskrit, and a Soha at the end, and it says it carries the power of truth when we chant this. Basically, something we can verify empirically, that phenomena arise on the basis of causes, and we can do something about this. It's a very empowering insight. So Thupten Jinpa then writes, there is, however, a further level of meaning to the notion of dependence, whereby dependence permeates the entirety of everything, not just their origin, but even their very identity. The idea here is this: even the seemingly simple concept of fire, for instance, presupposes an entire backdrop of experience, convention, language use, and conceptual framework, which includes our assumptions about its relation to fuel, function of burning, and so on. So it's not just where did the fire come from, but it's also our way of perceiving fire. Can be seen as something useful, something dangerous, depending relative to us, and the way that we distinguish and label fire. All of this identifies how fire doesn't just exist from its own side or as a monolithic, essential phenomenon. It's something really that depends how we see it. Thupten Jinpa continues, seen in this way, cause and effect are mutually dependent, with one defining or leaning on the other. In this sense, dependent arising becomes a most radical principle. This actually enables the mutually dependency. It enables us to begin to see that this solidity that we project onto phenomena actually is non-existent. And the thing is, it frees us. It frees our mind in terms of our perception of ourselves, and it also frees our ordinary limited understanding of our perceived reality. We'll be going into this a lot, but anyway, Thupten Jinpa formulates this really beautifully, so I wanted to include a lot of what he writes. It states that every single concept we have is utterly contingent, and the notion of an independent entity with its own identity, with defined boundaries, is simply untenable. Everything is leaning on something else in such a way that to speak of things and events as if they possess some kind of autonomy necessarily involves falsification and gross approximation. We actually miss reality. And if we just missed reality and we were happy, that would be fine. But the problem is we suffer as a consequence. Thupten Jinpa continues, thus, for someone like Nagarjuna, dependent arising is both a reason as well as the conclusion for critical inquiry into the nature of reality. Things and events are devoid of intrinsic existence because they are dependent originations. At the same time, things and events are dependent arising, for independent existence and identity are utterly untenable. So basically the problem is we get things wrong. We misunderstand reality. And so with the insight into dependent arising, we begin to see things more for what they are. Not so much that we're being given a new formula for what they are, but it's more we begin to see through our limiting, the way that we limit our perceptions. So it's not so much that we're being given a new dogma, but we're being given a method to actually penetrate dogma. Nagarjuna, he continues, in fact suggests an equation between emptiness and dependent arising, and states this is indeed the true middle way. And then in the Mula Madhyamika Karika, the treatise on the middle way, it says here, and this is, it then says, whatever is dependently arisen, this has been explained as empty. Independence upon something else is imputed as existent. This is the middle way indeed. So what we perceive as something that is existent is in fact something that exists in dependency. And since it exists in dependency, it doesn't have its own intrinsic solid reality. If you want to see, if you want, this is Thupten Jinpa that continues, if you want, one sees the same world without the filters and the blinders we project, but we see the world as it is, vibrant, present, and deeply interconnected. So when we begin to remove these blinders, then we begin to touch on the world in a more real way. So the understanding of the middle way, emptiness, shunyata, and so forth, is not about seeing nothing, it's about seeing clearer. Thupten Jinpa continues, Nagarjuna and his tradition never viewed the teaching on emptiness and dependent origination to be simply a matter of philosophy. For them, the insight into this truth of dependent arising constitutes the very heart of the path to true awakening. As Nagarjuna puts it, the purpose of emptiness is to bring about the cessation of conceptual elaboration, which lies at the root of our grasping, psychological imprisonment to a solidified notion of reality, and emotional reactivity in our relationship with the world around us. So this is where Buddhism, Nagarjuna, the Buddha, and so forth, goes beyond just philosophizing. We're not going to be able to really benefit unless we go beyond ordinary conceptual thought, what we call conceptual elaboration. To bring about a cessation of conceptual elaboration doesn't mean we stop thinking, but we begin to see through the hoax. We begin to see where we're flawed. And that's where Elizabeth's notion of the open questioning. We begin to actually gently just have an open, inquiring attitude with regards to reality, rather than trying to freeze reality into already existing, you could say, concepts. And so the middle way is something to be experienced. It's not enough to just have the ideas, but actually to experience this is to begin to live this freedom and begin to taste it. And that's where we are inquiring into what it is that where we grasp, and we're being aware of it, and through that, and also through then deepening this experience through meditation and integrating this in our ordinary life, then we could say this ordinary solidified idea of me versus the world and so forth, and all the emotional reactivity, all the emotions, the I like this, I don't like that, all of that is undermined. All of that which actually keeps us imprisoned, which sets up walls and barriers, we begin to actually see through this. And that is where we begin to open up to a greater vision. He says, and this undoing of our habitual grasping, grounded in our fixation to an objectifiable self and world, requires the serious business of critical questioning into the very roots of our habituation and its mechanisms, so that we learn to view and relate to ourselves and the world in a way that is closer to the messy truth of profound interdependence. And so when we say the messy truth of profound interdependence, it's a little bit, it's not that this is actually not elegant philosophy, but it's more that in our contemporary language, we very often are aware that when we oversimplify things, we miss the open dimension of phenomena. And that's why we can talk about, we're not trying to tidy up things and put them into pigeonholes, but we're actually allowing complexity, and if you like, the messy truth of complexity. The 7th century Buddhist master Chandrakirti, an influential interpreter of Nagarjuna, shows this point in the following way. He says, the wise ones have declared that the cessation of conceptualization is a fruit of engaging in analysis. So that is where the way that we put an end to this belief, this rather naive belief in the way that we construct the world. This is something that we come about through looking, through analyzing, seeing through our assumptions. Finally, he says, the individual's own reality becomes the field of inquiry, and the truth revealed through such an inquiry reflects nothing but the complex web of interrelationships that is the fact of one's existence. If embodied in this manner, the insight into dependent arising can offer anyone, whether Buddhist or not, a truly liberating perspective. Our habitual, rigid dichotomies of self and other, inner and outer, subject and object, and so on, naturally dissolve, and we begin to see and live our lives in tune with the way things really are. So when we begin to look at our mind, it's a bit like what Chögyam Trungpa said, we turn our mind into a laboratory. We're not about the books, we're not about ideas, but we're looking how does the teaching work with our mind? And where is it not just the theory, but of course, intuiting and appreciating, seeing what's happening within our own psychology. We then also, develop the tool or the ability to look in and see that, in fact, everything that we have in the mind, it exists on the basis of shifting conditions. And that's where the notion of a solid, unchanging self, we actually need to begin to question that. And similarly also with our perceptions. The outer world, what we think in terms of ourselves in the outer world, what we think of self and other, all these dualities, we begin to see that their existence, the way that we habitually see them, is actually unfounded. And that's where we begin to embrace this open dimension. The image of the wheel of life, over here on the right side of the page, shows us the 12 links of dependent arising. I'm not going to go into this right here, but that is then yama, the dualistic confused mind, then holds this condition that is confusion. And it's actually a very, it's a brilliant way of presenting how confusion plays out. On the outer ring, you have the 12 links of dependent arising. And then inside, you have the various realms that we imprison ourselves in through our confusion. And the inner hub with its black and white semicircles indicate what takes us down and what takes us up. And at the heart, we have then the ego, basic ignorance that is connected to attachment and aversion. So this is, this, if you like, is a more classical presentation of dependent arising that we have from Thupten Jinpa. And Elizabeth's is is slightly different in the flavor, more sort of connected with some of the imagery and the culture of our modern world. But at the same time, also, I would say it's very good to have some connection with the classical presentations. Thupten Jinpa is very much somebody who can bridge these two paradigms and discourses. Zika Rinpoche, he has a brief forward here, and in the forward he also says, Praticca Samutpada is a subtle but powerful teaching that lies at the heart of all the Buddha's teachings, transcending time and culture, always relevant because it is the key to gaining insight into the nature of how things are beyond dogma and beliefs. Praticca Samutpada leads to a full understanding of all one needs to know. As Nagarjuna says, one who knows dependent arising knows the Dharma. One who knows the Dharma knows dependent arising. Also, as Thupten Jinpa was quoting from the Pali Canon. Now, what's important here is that we understand that what we are speaking about when we say Praticca Samutpada transcends time and culture. When, for example, doctors, they might go out and teach in various cultures how, for example, boiling certain objects can purify them, or how you can implement certain practices of hygiene that will benefit everybody. That's not that the doctors come with a particular belief system that they're presenting, but in fact, it's an insight into just the nature of reality. And so when we're studying Praticca Samutpada, we're not studying something that is really limited to Buddhism. Just like doctors, they might come from, what do you have, Stanford or wherever, with their insights and so forth. What they're teaching has nothing to do with American culture or their particular institution. It's just a knowledge of how reality is. So it's not a sort of a Stanfordian dogma that they're bringing. It's not a Stanfordian teaching. It's just an insight into. It helps if you boil things; they can help for hygiene in some contexts. And similarly, also Praticca Samutpada. Yes, it's taught by the Buddha, but it's a way to see reality. So in her preface, then Elizabeth then says. She speaks about how she came to this and how when she was a young woman, when she was a child actually, when she would go to the local church and she had she was attracted to this, to the spirituality, and she would light candles and so on without really having any particular concept around it, except just being drawn and attracted to this. And she writes, the experience of awe and humility that I sometimes encountered inspired this early impulse to devotion and aroused in me a longing to express it. I intuitively understood that this was something that arose deep within the nature of my being, and it didn't occur to me to name it. So this is something I personally also experienced as a child, and some intuitive appreciation of the sacred, something unconditional. And also I've spoken with many people who have had this similar experience. She also writes, the allegiance I have to this experience, that I will call grace here, for the sake of talking about it, has led me on an active, ongoing search, both within and outside the boundaries of my own mind. At the heart of this search lies questions such as, what incites these momentary experiences of well-being? Why do they come and go? And when I don't feel them, does this mean something is lacking in me? Do I lack faith? It wasn't until my early 20s that I encountered the teachings on dependent arising, Praticca Samutpada, in Sanskrit, that I slowly began to find words that spoke directly to these questions. So she describes how she was sitting with Jakob Rinpoche in the Dulikel, which is in the outskirts of the Kathmandu Valley, and the view is somewhat as you see it here. And she was sitting with Rinpoche, who then was her teacher. And she says, Rinpoche turned toward me and holding up his hands with the tips of his two index fingers, like this, right? Pressing together in a way that created a triangular roof-like shape, asked, Lizzie, is this, meaning the shape, 1 or 2? I thought it was some kind of trick question. 1 or 2 what? I wondered. I looked at the triangle and saw 2 fingers composing the shape, so I could not say that this shape was one thing. Yet I couldn't say the triangle was 2 either, right? So I replied, not 1 or 2, not the same or separate. So Rinpoche liked this. Now, yeah, just to go back to that moment actually, because this is something that we want to arrive at in our cultivation of wisdom. We say wisdom is based on 3 aspects really. One is that we hear something new, like something is penetrating. It's not always easy because we sometimes a bit caught up in our own version of reality. But if something penetrates, particularly, of course, if we're Buddhists and we give the Buddha the benefit of the doubt and we want to hear what he has to say, then we first take it in, we hear it, and then we need to process it on a very personal level, where we begin to say, not just I'm learning these teachings and they must be right because the Buddha says so, because the Dalai Lama subscribed to it, to these views, but we begin to see where it actually fits in terms of our experience. And that's where we have these aha moments, where we go, actually the way that I perceive solidity is actually something that's made up, but at the same time I can't just say it's this, that, or the other, and possibly we could free ourselves. And in the case of Elizabeth, I actually think she's a fair bit smarter than I am. What she's arriving at here in her very early 20s is not something that I actually began to really sort of intuit until a lot later. So clearly here's a prodigy Buddhist student, hence we're studying her. But this is, you could say, this logic of insight. This is a bit of Satori. It's not an enlightenment as such. And of course, we shouldn't take it for that. Well, I'm not saying that Elizabeth possibly didn't get enlightened at this point, but in general, we could say that this is something that brings about something that lies beyond the intellect. And that's also where we begin to see there's a dimension of truth that is not necessarily about labeling things, but perhaps of being free of labels. Now, then she describes how she proceeded, and sometimes then the process of being a student of Buddhism sometimes ran into a certain orthodox methodology. She talks about how these unexamined assumptions about spirituality led to rigid orthodoxy based on blind faith. And this we can sometimes come about when, of course, Buddhism is something that has existed for 2,500 years, and there has been many brilliant ways of presenting it. But then when we come and we begin to study Buddhism, then we come at it as we come into a classroom, and of course there is some existing systems already in place. And that is where sometimes if we can't connect with it right away, we might have a sort of a dry spell of not quite being able to relate to some of the teaching. And of course, that's where we need to be stubborn, and we need to push through to until we understand it, or else also sometimes just relax and say, okay, I haven't understood it right now. I'm sure it'll come. But we do, of course, encounter sometimes this milieu or this culture around Buddhism where there is these kind of like hard-edged, as she calls them, hard-edged rights and wrongs. This is how it's done, and this is how we should believe. We should believe in karma. We should accept rebirth. We should accept enlightenment and so forth. And that becomes sort of moralistic instead of actually having these insights as something that actually tickles us and pushes us to sort of begin to have greater insights. So she then confesses or she writes how I watched the liveliness drain out of my spiritual practice. And this, of course, this losing the inspiration in terms of just inquiry, she says, this all struck me as a contradiction. Didn't the Buddha famously encourage his disciples to trust their own process of awakening when he said to them, don't simply believe what I say out of respect. Examine my words as a goldsmith examines gold. As I wrestled with my own and others' spiritual ideals, I often wondered, where has the child of awe of its fathomless, in awe of its fathomless universe gone? Now, when we arrive at that, and also personally, this was a big thing in my own journey, which is that moment where you begin to really doubt and you begin to be conflicted. And there's a place where then this tension actually really, it's driven by a basic trust. You can see there is something to be gained here, but you're also frustrated because you're not really understanding. And maybe also you begin to lose the trust in the basic premise of the entire journey. Enlightenment, of course, it's an unknown. It's something that's intuitive as a potential. It's something that, of course, is described to great length in the scriptures and all of that. But on the basic, immediate, personal, visceral level, then there is this nagging thing called doubt. And as one American Buddhist teacher says, doubt is actually the gateway to faith. Because once we begin to question, then actually we trust what is there enough to actually question it. And so she also makes a point about how real faith is something that emerges out of the pain when not being able to reconcile theory and experience. Doubt comes from trusting in the possibility of resolution. And Elizabeth quotes German theologian Paul Tillich, who said that doubt is an element of faith. She says, I inevitably move in and out of the experience of grace, but I find that I don't lose my way if I continually pursue it. In fact, I might even call the pursuit of grace faith. And that is the premise of the path. It's not so much that we're going to be switched on and off, which obviously happens, but it's more that we need to have that continual wish and sustain this wish through the discipline of the practice of the path. And that is then something that we undertake in the spirit of faith, of basic trust. If we look at the word faith in our contemporary culture, then, as Elizabeth points out, then it is sometimes seen faith is a many splendored thing. It is sometimes understood as fundamentalism. It's often understood as that. It's often understood as dogma. As an insider, then faith has to do with confidence. It has to do with spiritual insight. But that's not at all something that's taken for granted in the modern world. And Sam Harris, famously in his End of Faith, he links faith to fundamentalism. That's very common. But again, the Buddhist take on faith, very different. Tongsagen Rinpoche, he will say faith, and he quotes Saraha. I haven't found the place in Tibetan, but Rinpoche says, for Saraha, faith is trusting cause and effect. And Trungpa Rinpoche Rinpoche also says something similar. He says, Trungpa Rinpoche Rinpoche, he links faith to the nature of existence of what we perceive. And he says, cows have faith in grass. So we trust our phenomena. We have some idea in what is real. So touching on what is real, that is that notion of having safety, found something that's reliable, faith. Anyway, as far as faith as the word goes, right, the F word, she says, given the multiplicity of definitions one finds around faith, and given how crucial it is to our very existence, faith is worthy of deep considerations. So, as she found out when she was beginning to talk about this, and I would like to say I really respect Elizabeth for bringing this up, because this is such an important thing, and it's something that is so neglected. As she points out, faith is not necessarily a cool term. It's something that, by the way, I hope you can hear me. There's a little bit of rain where I am. I hope that's not a problem. Is the sound okay? If one of you could just confirm the sound is okay. Anyway, when she was presenting some of her workshops, she would include the word faith, and there was somebody who said that's the kind of word, that's the kind of stuff my granny would talk about. Obviously it's associated with ignorance, but the thing is, faith is something that goes very deep in terms of what is true for us. So it's something that informs us, our hearts, and what we trust and live for, really on a very deep and real level. So it's something that needs to be addressed. So it's something that's very real, but particularly in this mechanistic reductionist culture of materialism, then it's something that is not spoken about. It's something that is not really seen as something that's easy. It's not something that you talk about at dinner parties necessarily. Depends where you dine. Anyway, faith keeps, as she said, faith keeps your spiritual quest relevant and connected to the heart of the human predicament. So when we have this dimension of faith, it's not about the words, it's not about the dogmas, it's not about the right and wrong, but it's something about trusting what Trungpa Trungpa calls basic goodness, and what we associate with Buddha nature and Buddhism. And that is something that lies beyond the sort of the linear logic of ordinary language, but it's something that's very real, palpable in terms of our experience. Okay, I'm being told the sound is a bit weird, but okay, well, we'll have to deal with that. This is nature, rain. She says, my concern is also that by narrowing the definition of faith to blind acceptance or dogma, we risk losing genuine traditions of contemplative wisdom and practice that include faith. The initial function of spirituality emerged from questioning the human condition and also from deep experiences of wonder. The word religion itself, initially meaning to reconnect, religare, seems to have come from direct experiences of something larger than just a set of fixed ideas. It marked a return to something essential that we just fail to recognize in the myopia of our everyday lives. How curious that we turn experiences of awe into dogmas and stagnant ideas, that we have come to associate faith with fundamentalism, blindness, and even terrorism. This gives us something important to look at. So faith is something that touches on what is real, and we have many mystical traditions, certainly within many of the existing wisdom traditions. We have this notion of seeing and touching on something that is so real yet inexplicable, that is the dimension of wonder, but it's not something that we can necessarily understand in terms of data, in terms of just fixed ideas. Of course, very often when in the absence of actual experience, the message has been possibly compassionately communicated in words, but then the words have been objectified and they have become absolutes, or practices that are intended to facilitate the experience, they then also become objectified as absolute, and then we're looking at behavior rather than direct experience. So this is something that we need to get over. To us, the nature of reality is concealed. Buddha saw reality for what it is, hence he is known as the awakened one. He saw through our ignorant assumptions about reality as solid. He saw that phenomena are conditioned, arising in dependency. He saw praticca samutpada, dependent arising. So what the Buddha saw is that us as sentient beings, we solidify both self, our experience of our private psychology and our sense of individual being, and also the perception of the world around us. We misinterpret it. And from that point of view, we would say everything that we see, or rather reality, is concealed because we're caught up fixating on our relative projections. So we fail to see reality. So our conventional reality conceals the actual reality. The Buddha saw it, and of course we can see it too. So there's no difference in terms of the basic ground that we and the Buddha share, but because the Buddha awoke to this, then just like someone who's awoken from a dream is no longer caught by the dream, then we refer to the Buddha as the awakened one. But the Buddha is not in any way superior to us from the point of view of the ground. He is, however, awakened, and hence he can guide us. And so this is where the Buddha compassionately could see that we don't really see reality properly. We operate from ignorant assumptions. And this is where the Buddha's message to us is that what he saw. And if you look in the narratives of the Buddha's awakening, it describes how the Buddha, when he then awoke to enlightenment, he then saw this dependent nature of reality that stands in opposition to the solidified way that we perceive reality. And this teaching then is what he called praticca samutpada, dependent arising. So this dependent arising, it's the insight of the awakened ones. Not just one Buddha like Buddha Shakyamuni, but anybody who has awakened. Ever since the time of the Buddha, there have been countless men and women who saw this and who were set free through this insight. So our realities, they're conceived, they're perceived from our particular angle. So we say they're relatively concealed. And if we were to look at them, if we apply this insight of inquiry, of this process of inquiry, then we begin to see there's actually no absolute reality in this. And that's where we see our realities arise in dependency. They are conditional, they're relative. It is when we see this dependent or conditional nature of reality that we're free. And so Elizabeth says, this was the pivotal revelation of the Buddha, from which all his subsequent teachings unfolded. By the way, if it's the first time that you're attending one of these webinars, please, the format here is that you can type in questions. You have in the web edition, now there's, for the first time actually, I have somebody who's joining by telephone. So I'm not exactly sure how that's intended to work, but if you're joining by a webinar, then you can type in questions. There's on your software, there is a place where you can type questions. So if at any moment you have some questions, then please just type your question, and when I see there's a question, I'll usually stop at one point and try to answer. She says, and this then in regard to this open questioning, she says, Nagarjuna designed a series of methodical investigations based upon the Buddha's insight into the nature of dependent arising that provide a way for whoever employs them to bring together discerning intelligence with a mind of complete openness. The sole purpose of these investigations is to guide us away from the abstract realm of ideas into a direct relationship with life. So we are being given a apparatus, way, a method with way where we can begin to see reality free from our ordinary abstract realm, where we very often are caught up in our thought, and begin to connect with reality. So this is what the teaching is about. It's not ultimately an end in itself, but it is a method that is so valuable to enable us to then connect with a wider space. At the beginning you mentioned through Vipassana we see dependent arising. I understand Vipassana translates as clear seeing, but I have not heard it used contextually in this way. Could you say a bit more about Vipassana as used in this way? Type on phone. Okay, cool. Great. Thank you. So yes, the practice of Vipassana is based on the view of dependent arising. So when we practice Shamatha Vipassana, we practice in settling the mind through mindfulness, but then not being caught up in the ordinary conceptual projections that we have, the insight into dependent arising and the insight into how we are tripped up, we are confused through our objectification of our thoughts and our reactive patterns in terms of our perceptions, enable us to begin to see through the conceptual thoughts, the concepts, if you like, the way that we construct our reality. We catch on to the deceptive nature of this practice of objectification. So dependent arising informs our Vipassana. So when we understand dependent arising or praticca samutpada, we have what's called the view. In the general Buddhist teaching, we talk about the view as the insight that we have when we see dependent arising, when we see prajna paramita, when we see the majjhamika, and also more in the Vajrayana aspect of more direct insight. We talk about Mahamudra and Dzogchen. All of this is the view. And the way that we apply that is then through Vipassana meditation. And then in Vipassana meditation, we integrate this view in two ways. One is through analytical meditation, and that's very much along the lines of this open questioning. But open questioning also leads then to the second part, which is then the Vipassana of settling meditation. So we talk about analytical meditation and settling meditation. In Tibetan, Chegom and Jogom. And this is the way, these two aspects of Vipassana are the ways that we integrate this experience of this understanding of the view. So we engage with meditation with some idea of applying this method that Elizabeth is describing here. And this will enable us to gain some certainty about what we're doing when we then practice meditation. She says, When you ask an open question, you remain receptive, humble, and connected to the living and dynamic nature of things. According to this tradition, such characteristics describe a mind poised for insight. In fact, where insight is concerned, it is only an open and attentive mind that is said to perceive its object without mistake. So here we're presenting the possibility that we could connect with our reality without necessarily being caught by our habitual labels about reality. And that is where there's the possibility of letting go of these conceptual constructs. She says, I just want to introduce the idea of dependent arising, praticca samutpada, as your tool for exploring faith. And I want to make sure that you understand that although the methods used in this book come from the tradition of the Buddha, there is no assertion that insight itself is the possession of any one religion. So that's like we said before, there are certain laws about, how you, if you're going to, for example, the wheel. If there might be places where the wheel is not known, when somebody introduces the wheel, then it's not necessarily that they're introducing a wheel religion. It's an insight just of how we can operate within reality. Some of the methods presented in this book may challenge the assumptions you have about language, beliefs, doubts, spirituality, and the nature of knowing. They may bring to the fore some unexamined ideas you have about faith, and even prompt you to rethink how you see yourself and the world in which you live. But then, what's an exploration without challenges? So let me just emphasize that in presenting this book, what of course you're getting is what I'm identifying as valuable points in the book, but of course this is premised on you reading the book, so you're not getting a digest of the book. This is not a Reader's Digest of the logic of faith. It is very much just my sharing my enthusiasm about this book with, of course, my own particular way of interpreting and perceiving it. So this presentation cannot substitute actual reading the book. I say this because sometimes my friends, they confess to me that they sort of rely on me to tell them what the book says. Okay. There's somebody who wants the etymology. Oh, good. You might have me on the spot there. Can the word praticca samutpada be broken down into its parts to show how it means dependent arising? Okay, thank you very much. You've given me some homework. I shall return to the drawing board and look into that. I actually would not be able to answer that. Nope. So, okay, I shall look into it. I'll tell you next time. Okay. So, for the next session that we're going to have together, please read then chapter 1. What do I know? Okay. Any other questions? Gosh, this will be a historical moment. One of the few times that I've actually finished within the set time. Very often we go a little over time. So, okay. No other questions? All right. Same time, same place next week. Thank you very much for joining me. And this is actually a dedication prayer that was written by Nagarjuna. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas, which arise from merit and wisdom.